Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the earth feels ancient, and the sun burns with a relentless gold. We are walking the complete path of the son of Zeus, the bearer of the sky, Heracles. The world of the ancient Greeks was not merely a collection of cities and fields. It was a stage where the breath of the divine moved through the reeds of the riverbeds and the shadows of the marble halls. To understand the man who would become the greatest of all heroes, we must first understand the silence that preceded his arrival. We must go back to a time when the stars seemed to hang lower in the sky, and the blood of the Titan slayer Perseus still ran thick and potent in the veins of kings. The story begins in the city of Thebes, but its roots are buried deep in the soil of Mycenae and Tiryns. Our focus rests upon a woman of extraordinary grace and intellect, named Alcmene. She was the daughter of Electryon, the king of Mycenae, and a granddaughter of the great Perseus. Ancient chroniclers describe Alcmene not just for her physical beauty, which was said to rival that of Aphrodite, but for a wisdom and a stature that commanded the respect of gods. She was tall, regal, and possessed eyes that held the depth of the Aegean at twilight. Alcmene was betrothed to her cousin, Amphitryon, a noble prince and a warrior of high repute. However, their union was born in the shadow of tragedy and exile. Through a series of unfortunate events involving a dispute over cattle and the accidental killing of Electryon by Amphitryon's own hand, the couple was forced to flee Mycenae. They sought refuge in Thebes, where King Creon purified Amphitryon of his blood guilt. Yet, a condition remained before their marriage could be consummated. Alcmene, bound by the memory of her brothers who had fallen in battle against the Teleboans, made a solemn vow. She would not share the marriage bed until Amphitryon had avenged their deaths and returned victorious from the war. Amphitryon, driven by love and duty, departed for the islands of the Teleboans. It was during his absence, as the moon waxed and waned over the silent palace of Thebes, that the king of the gods, Zeus, looked down from the heights of Mount Olympus. Zeus did not look upon Alcmene with the fleeting whim of a mortal, but with a divine purpose that had been brewing in his mind for generations. He sought to father a protector for both gods and men, a champion who would possess the strength to steer the world through the coming storms of chaos. In Alcmene, the last and greatest of the Perseid line, he found the perfect vessel for this celestial legacy. The night Zeus chose to descend was unlike any other in the history of time. It is a night referred to by the poets as the Triple Night. Zeus, knowing the virtue of Alcmene and her steadfast devotion to her husband, realized that only a masterpiece of deception would allow him to approach her. He did not come as a golden shower or a swan. He took the form of Amphitryon himself. Imagine the scene in the bedchamber. The lamps flickered with a low amber light, and the scent of cedarwood and dried herbs hung heavy in the air. Zeus, cloaked perfectly in the likeness of the weary warrior, walked through the doors. He spoke with Amphitryon's voice, carried himself with Amphitryon's gait, and recounted the tales of the battles fought on the Teleboan shores. He presented her with the gold cup of the Teleboan king as proof of his victory. Alcmene, seeing her husband returned and his vow fulfilled, welcomed him with open arms. To ensure that the conception of his champion was undisturbed, Zeus commanded Hermes to go to the sun god, Helios. The order was absolute. Helios was to unyoke his golden chariot and stay his course. The moon was commanded to move slowly, and sleep was told to bind the eyes of the world in a profound, unnatural slumber. For 3 full cycles of the sun, the world remained in darkness. The stars remained fixed in their positions, and the birds stayed silent in the trees. In that elongated, sacred space of time, the seed of the greatest hero was planted. As the sun finally rose on the 4th day, the real Amphitryon returned to the palace, his heart full of anticipation. He found Alcmene calm, showing none of the exuberant passion he expected from a wife seeing her husband after months of war. When he spoke of his victories, she replied with confusion, stating that he had already recounted these tales the night before. Amphitryon, struck by a growing sense of dread and mystery, consulted the blind seer Tiresias. The prophet, whose eyes saw the patterns of the gods, revealed the staggering truth. Zeus had visited his home. Amphitryon, though humbled and perhaps burdened by the knowledge of sharing his wife with the All-Father, accepted the divine will. In the months that followed, it became clear that Alcmene carried twins, one the son of a mortal prince, and the other the son of the king of the sky. But where there is the favor of Zeus, there is inevitably the shadow of Hera. The queen of Olympus, the goddess of marriage and the guardian of sacred bonds, looked down upon the looming birth with a cold and piercing fury. She did not merely see another infidelity. She saw the rise of a hero who would embody everything she resented about Zeus's independence. She watched as the time for Alcmene's labor approached, and she devised a plan of such legalistic cruelty that it would haunt Heracles for the rest of his life. At that time, another woman of the Perseid line, the wife of King Sthenelus of Mycenae, was also pregnant. Her child was only 7 months along. Zeus, in a moment of pride and perhaps overconfidence, stood before the assembly of the gods and made a fateful oath. He declared that on that very day, a child born of the blood of Perseus would be brought into the light, and this child would rule over all who lived around him. He intended this child to be his son, the one being carried by Alcmene. Hera, smiling with a malice that would make the fates themselves tremble, asked Zeus to swear that this would be so. Once the oath was sealed by the Styx, Hera descended to earth like a lightning strike. She sped to Mycenae and used her divine power to accelerate the labor of Sthenelus' wife. At the same time, she traveled to Thebes and sought out the midwives and the goddesses of childbirth, the Eileithyai. In the shadows of Alcmene's palace, a silent war was waged. Hera commanded the goddesses of labor to sit outside Alcmene's door, with their legs crossed and their fingers tightly interlaced. This was a form of sympathetic magic. As long as the goddesses remained bound and closed, Alcmene's womb would remain sealed. The agony Alcmene endured was beyond mortal description. For 7 days and nights, she screamed in a pain that echoed through the hills of Boeotia, yet the children would not come. In Mycenae, however, the 7-month-old child was thrust prematurely into the world. He was a frail, sickly, and fearful infant named Eurystheus. Because he was born of the Perseid line on the day Zeus had specified, the oath was binding. Eurystheus, the weakling, would be the king, and Zeus's champion would be his subject. Back in Thebes, Alcmene was on the verge of death. She was saved only by the quick thinking of her loyal servant, a woman named Galanthus. Galanthus noticed the strange women sitting outside the chamber, their posture rigid and their hands clenched. Suspecting divine interference, Galanthus suddenly ran out of the room and shouted with joy, "My mistress has given birth! By the will of the gods, the boy is born!" The goddesses of childbirth, startled by this unexpected news and thinking their magic had somehow failed, jumped up and threw their hands wide in surprise. In that split second of release, the knots of magic were untied. Alcmene's labor reached its climax, and she gave birth to 2 sons. First came the son of Zeus, who was initially named Alcides, and then came his brother Iphicles, the son of Amphitryon. Hera, enraged by Galanthus's trickery, transformed the servant into a weasel, a creature destined to live in the shadows and give birth through its mouth, as she had used her mouth to deceive the gods. But the damage to Hera's plan was done. The hero was alive, though his inheritance had been stolen. The early days of the infants were marked by a peace that was only the eye of the storm. Zeus, perhaps hoping to grant his son a measure of divine protection, or perhaps to appease Hera in some small way, devised a plan to have the infant nurse at Hera's breast. It is said that while Hera slept, Hermes placed the young Alcides at her nipple. The milk of the Queen of Heaven was the substance of immortality. The infant, possessing a strength that was already beyond his years, began to nurse with such vigor that Hera woke in pain. She pushed the child away with a cry, and as her divine milk sprayed across the heavens, it created the great band of light we now know as the Milky Way. In that moment, though she rejected him, she had inadvertently granted him the strength of the immortals. As the boys reached the age of 8 or 10 months, Hera decided to test the nature of the children and perhaps finish what she had started at their birth. One evening, after Alcmene had bathed the twins and fed them, she placed them in a large bronze shield that Amphitryon had won in battle. It was a cradle of war for the sons of warriors. The palace grew still. The moon cast long, silvery shadows across the stone floor, and the infants drifted into sleep. Suddenly, the heavy bronze doors of the nursery creaked open without the touch of a hand. 2 massive serpents, their scales the color of tarnished emerald, and their eyes glowing like burning coals, slithered into the room. Hera had sent them, not just to kill, but to reveal. As the snakes coiled over the rim of the shield, their forked tongues flickering in the dark, the young Iphicles woke. He saw the shimmering scales and the bared fangs, and he let out a scream of pure, mortal terror. He scrambled out of the shield, weeping, and ran toward the safety of his mother's chambers. But Alcides did not run. He did not cry. He sat up in the shield, his small hands reaching out into the darkness. To him, the serpents were not monsters. They were the first toys of his destiny. As the snakes lunged, their necks swelling with venom, the infant grabbed them, one in each hand. His fingers sank into the thick, muscular flesh just behind their heads. In the corridors of the palace, Amphitryon and Alcmene heard the screams of Iphicles. Amphitryon seized his sword and rushed into the nursery, followed by the servants with torches. The flickering light of the flames revealed a scene that froze the blood of everyone present. The young Alcides was laughing. He held the 2 serpents aloft, his tiny muscles rippling under his skin. The snakes were thrashing, their bodies coiling around his arms in a desperate struggle for life, but the infant's grip was like a vice of cold iron. He squeezed until the serpents' eyes bulged and their life was choked out of them. With a final triumphant gurgle, he tossed the dead monsters to the floor and reached out for his father. Amphitryon stood in awe. He knew then without the need for prophets or seers, that he was raising a child who would belong to the ages. He sent once more for Tiresias, the seer of Thebes. The old man came and stood before the family, his sightless eyes turned toward the heavens. He began to chant, his voice echoing with the weight of the future. He spoke of the monsters the boy would slay, of the giants he would crush on the plains of Phlegra, and of the labors that would cleanse the earth of its ancient horrors. He spoke of the peace that would come at the end of a life of fire and blood, and of the seat that waited for him among the 12 immortals on the heights of Olympus. From that day forward, the boy's education was treated as a matter of state and divine importance. Amphitryon sought out the finest teachers in all of Greece to shape the raw power of his son. He himself taught the boy how to drive a chariot, how to guide the horses with a touch that was both firm and gentle. Autolycus, the son of Hermes, taught him the art of wrestling, how to use an opponent's weight against them, and how to find the leverage that could break a mountain. Eurytus, the king of Oechalia, taught him the bow. It was said that the young hero's arrows moved with the speed of thought and never strayed from their mark. Castor, the Dioscuri prince, taught him how to fight in heavy armor, and Polydeuces instructed him in the art of boxing. Even the mind was not neglected. Rhadamanthus, the judge of the underworld, taught him the virtues of justice and law. But there was one teacher whose fate would highlight the turbulent nature of the hero's spirit. This was Linus, the brother of Orpheus, a man whose music could charm the stones and soothe the savage beast. He was tasked with teaching the boy the lyre. The young hero, however, was a creature of the wild earth, and his hands were made for the bow and the club, not the delicate strings of an instrument. One day, frustrated by the boy's lack of progress, or perhaps his lack of discipline, Linus struck him. It was a common enough practice in the schools of the time, a sharp rebuke to steer a wandering mind. But the hero was not a common boy. The strike ignited a spark of that divine, uncontrollable rage that Zeus had planted in his marrow. Without thinking, he picked up the lyre and struck Linus. The instrument, made of wood and gut, was a fragile thing. But in the hands of the son of Zeus, it became a lethal weapon. One blow was all it took. Linus fell dead, his music silenced forever. The city of Thebes was in an uproar. A murder had been committed, and the victim was a man of high standing and sacred craft. Amphitryon, fearing for his son's future, and perhaps for the stability of the city, brought the boy before the judges. The hero, even at this young age, showed the first signs of that peculiar wisdom that would define him. He quoted a law of Rhadamanthus, which stated that he who kills in self-defense should go unpunished. The judges, moved by the boy's logic, and perhaps intimidated by the power he radiated even in silence, acquitted him. However, Amphitryon realized that the city was no place for a storm in human form. He decided to send the boy away to the high pastures of Mount Kithairon, to live among the herdsmen and the cattle. It was here, under the open sky and the watchful eyes of the stars, that the hero truly came into his own. He grew to a height of 4 cubits, nearly 7 feet, and his frame became a cathedral of muscle and bone. His eyes burned with the fire of his father, and it was said that no man could look him in the face without feeling a sense of profound awe or primal fear. He lived simply, sleeping on the hard ground and eating only what the land provided. He became a protector of the herds, a nightmare for the wolves and the lions that dared to descend from the crags. It was during this period, as a youth of 18, that he performed his first great deed of valor. A massive lion, known as the Ciceronian lion, was ravaging the herds of both Amphitryon and King Thespius of Thespiae. The beast was a shadow in the night, a killer that defied the spears of the local hunters. The hero did not hesitate. He hunted the lion for 50 days, tracking it through the deep ravines and the sun-scorched ridges of the mountain. During this time he stayed at the palace of King Thespius. The king, recognizing the divine potential in his guest and wishing to have his lineage blessed by such a man, performed a feat of hospitality that has become legendary. Each night, he sent one of his 50 daughters to the hero's bed. The hero, either unaware of the deception or perhaps possessing a vitality that was as boundless as the sea, lay with all 50 women. From these unions, 50 sons would be born, the Heraclidae, who would go on to colonize the islands of the Mediterranean and carry their father's name into the future. Finally, on the 50th day, the hero cornered the lion. He did not use a bow from a distance or a trap from the safety of a blind. He faced the beast with a club he had carved from a wild olive tree. The struggle was a primal symphony of bone-striking fur. With a final, massive blow, he slew the lion. He did not merely leave the carcass for the vultures. He skinned it, using the beast's own claws to part the hide. In some versions of the myth, it is this lion's skin that he first wore as a cloak, with its head serving as a helmet, though most traditions reserve this honor for the Nemean Lion of his later labors. As he returned to Thebes, a champion in his own right, he encountered a group of heralds from the city of Orchomenus. They were coming to collect a humiliating tribute of 100 cattle from the Thebans. The hero, his blood still hot from the hunt, and his sense of justice flared, did not stand aside. He seized the heralds, cut off their ears and noses, and tied them around their necks with ropes. "Take this tribute back to your king," he told them. The king of Orchomenus, Erginus, was predictably enraged. He marched on Thebes with a massive army. Amphitryon and the Thebans prepared for war, but they were outnumbered and out-equipped. It was then that the hero stepped forward. He did not wait for a command. He gathered the youth of Thebes, and with the aid of the goddess Athena, who bestowed upon him a magnificent set of armor and a shield that shone like the sun, he led the charge. The battle was a massacre. The hero moved through the ranks of the Orchomenians like a scythe through wheat. He slew King Erginus with his own hand and forced the remnants of the army to pay a double tribute back to Thebes. It was a victory that secured the safety of his home, but it came at a high cost. His mortal father, Amphitryon, fell in the heat of the fray, fighting bravely beside his son. The hero wept for the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him the chariot and the law. King Creon of Thebes, in gratitude for the salvation of his city, gave the hero his eldest daughter, Megara, in marriage. This was a time of true happiness, a brief summer of peace in a life destined for winter. Megara was a woman of noble spirit, and she bore him 3 strong sons. The hero was a father, a husband, and a prince of the city. He was the most beloved man in Greece, a figure of such brilliance that it seemed even the gods must smile upon him. But Hera was still watching. She had not forgotten the deception of Galanthus, the theft of the divine milk, or the death of her serpents. She saw his happiness, and she saw his pride, and she knew that the higher a man stands, the further he has to fall. She waited until the hero was at the height of his glory, until his heart was full of peace, and his house was full of laughter. And then she reached down from the heights of Olympus and breathed a fog into his mind. It was not a fog of confusion, but a fog of madness, a red, pulsing insanity that transformed his friends into monsters and his children into demons. The hero, the son of Zeus, the protector of Thebes, looked at his own hearth and saw a den of giants. He looked at his beautiful wife and his 3 young sons, and in his shattered perception, they became the enemies of the gods. He reached for his bow. He reached for his club. The silence that followed the screams in that house was a silence that would echo through eternity. It was the sound of a hero's soul breaking, and it was in this silence, in the ashes of his own happiness, that the true journey of Heracles, the quest for the soul and the cleansing of the world, was about to begin. The air in the house of the hero, once filled with the sweet scent of roasting meat and the bright, rhythmic laughter of children, now held a stillness that was suffocating. Madness, when it comes from the gods, does not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets or a visible storm. It arrives as a distortion of the senses, a subtle shifting of the light, until the familiar becomes the alien. In the tragedies of the ancient world, this madness was personified as Lyssa, the daughter of Night, a terrifying figure with snakes for hair and eyes that burned with a cold, unblinking fever. It was she whom Hera sent to the doorstep of the hero in Thebes. Imagine the hero standing by the hearth. He had just returned from a sacrifice, his hands still clean from the ritual wash. He looked at his 3 sons, young boys who bore the strength of their father in their limbs and the grace of their mother, Megara, in their eyes. But as the fog of Lyssa descended, the hero's mind buckled. The hearth fire did not flicker with warmth. It roared with the flames of an enemy siege. The pillars of his own home were no longer marble and cedar. They were the battlements of the palace of Eurystheus in Mycenae, the man who had stolen his birthright. In this fractured reality, his children were no longer his sons. They were the offspring of his enemies, the spawn of giants, and the monsters that sought to dismantle the world he protected. Megara, rushing forward to stop him, became a phantom of betrayal. The bow that had slain the Ciceronian lion was notched. The club that had defended Thebes was raised. The primary texts, particularly the searing accounts of Euripides, describe the scene with a visceral intensity that transcends time. The hero moved with a speed that was both divine and demonic. One by one, the children fell. He hunted them through the corridors of his own palace, believing he was clearing a path to the throne of a tyrant. When the red mist finally began to thin, and the screams had died into a silence that was heavier than any sound, the hero collapsed. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, exhausted by the labor of his own insanity. It was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and his lifelong protectress, who finally intervened. Seeing that Hera's malice had reached its peak, Athena descended into the blood-stained hall. She took a massive stone, a rock known in local tradition as the Sophronister, or the Restrainer, and cast it against the hero's chest. The impact did not break his ribs, but it broke the spell. The madness was shattered. When the hero opened his eyes, the world had returned to its proper shape. The sun was rising over the hills of Thebes, casting long, golden fingers through the high windows, but the gold was stained with crimson. He looked at his hands. He looked at the floor. He looked at the broken bodies of his sons and the still form of Megara. The realization was not a sudden shock. It was a slow, agonizing dawning that felt like cold iron entering his heart. He did not cry out. The grief of the son of Zeus was too vast for tears. He sat in the dust and the blood, a mountain of a man reduced to a heap of ash. He sought to end his own life, to cast himself from the heights of the Cadmea. But his friends and his kin, including the noble Theseus of Athens, came to him. They spoke of the burden of the living. They spoke of the fact that the gods had conspired against him, but the blood was still on his hands. To the Greeks, blood guilt, or miasma, was a physical thing. It was a stain on the soul that could not be washed away with water alone. It required a journey, a ritual, and a profound submission to the divine will. The hero left Thebes. He could no longer stay in the city he had saved, for the ghosts of his children were in the stones of every street. He traveled to the city of Delphi, the center of the world, where the Omphalos stone marked the navel of the earth. He walked the sacred way, past the treasuries of the great city-states, until he stood before the temple of Apollo. The air was thick with the scent of laurel and the sulphurous vapors that rose from the depths of the earth. He sought the Pythia, the priestess who spoke the words of Apollo. He sat on the tripod in the inner sanctum, his head bowed, his massive frame trembling with a suppressed sorrow. The prophecy that came forth was the pivot on which the history of the world would turn. The Pythia did not speak of comfort. She did not offer easy forgiveness. She told him that to cleanse his soul, he must travel to the city of Tyrans. He must serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, the very man who had been born prematurely to steal his throne, for 12 years. He must perform whatever tasks the king set before him. It was during this encounter at Delphi that the hero received his name. Until this moment, he had been known as Alcides, but the Pythia addressed him as Heracles. It is a name of profound irony and cosmic significance. It means the glory of Hera. The priestess explained that it was through the trials sent by Hera, through the suffering and the labors she would inflict upon him, that his eternal glory would be forged. His fame would not come from his father's lightning, but from the resistance he offered to his stepmother's hate. The hero accepted his fate. He walked toward the Peloponnese, toward the massive Cyclopean walls of Tiryns and Mycenae. These were cities built by the giants, with stones so large that no mortal hand could move them. Yet, as Heracles approached the gates, he felt like the smallest of men. He was a prince of the blood, a son of a god, yet he was coming to be a slave to a coward. King Eurystheus was everything Heracles was not. Where Heracles was tall, powerful, and brave, Eurystheus was slight, sickly, and governed by a fear that bordered on the pathetic. He lived in constant terror of his cousin, knowing that Heracles had every right to the throne he sat upon. When Heracles arrived and declared his submission, Eurystheus did not feel relief. He felt an opportunity to destroy his rival through the guise of duty. He determined that the tasks he would set would be impossible. He would send Heracles not to war, but to the jaws of the monsters that lingered in the dark corners of the world, creatures of the old age, leftovers from the time of the Titans. The first task was a challenge to the very concept of invulnerability. In the valley of Nemea, not far from the city, lived a lion of unnatural size and supernatural origin. Some said it was the offspring of the monster Typhon and Echidna. Others claimed it had fallen from the moon. This was no ordinary predator. Its hide was so thick and so magically reinforced that no blade of bronze, no point of iron, and no arrow of wood could pierce it. The weapons of men simply bounced off its fur as if striking a mountain of granite. Heracles traveled to Nemea. He found the valley deserted, the vineyards untended, and the people hiding in their homes. The lion had turned the fertile land into a slaughterhouse. He tracked the beast to a cave with 2 entrances. Using his immense strength, he blocked one of the openings with rocks and brush, forcing the lion into a confrontation in the darkness. He first tried his bow. He loosed an arrow that would have felled a bull, but it struck the lion's flank and fell harmlessly to the grass. He tried his sword, but the blade bent as if it had hit a stone wall. The lion roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the hills, and lunged. Heracles, realizing that the tools of civilization were useless against this primal force, cast aside his weapons. He met the lion with his bare hands. Imagine the struggle in the dim light of the cave. It was a contest of pure muscle and breath. Heracles wrapped his massive arms around the lion's neck, his fingers digging into the thick, golden mane. The lion clawed at his chest, tearing the skin, but the hero did not let go. He channeled the strength of his father and the desperation of his own soul. He squeezed. He choked the life out of the beast that could not be wounded. When the lion finally went limp, the first labor was complete. But a problem remained. He needed to prove his victory to Eurystheus, and he wished to take the lion's hide as a trophy and a defense. Yet, no knife could skin it. He spent hours trying every tool at his disposal until he looked at the lion itself. He realized that only the lion's own claws were sharp enough to cut its skin. Using a severed claw, he flayed the beast and fashioned the pelt into a cloak. The head became his helmet, the jaws framing his face, and the skin became a shield that no weapon could ever penetrate. From that day on, Heracles became a figure of golden fur and iron muscle, an icon that would be recognized by every generation to come. When he returned to Tiryns and tossed the carcass of the lion at the feet of Eurystheus, the king was so terrified by the sight of the dead monster and the power of the hero that he fled. He ran to the bowels of his palace and climbed into a large bronze jar, refusing to come out. He commanded that from then on, Heracles was not to enter the city. He was to receive his orders from a herald named Copreus, standing outside the walls. The second labor took Heracles to the swamps of Lerna. Deep in the stagnant waters, where the air was thick with the smell of rot and the hum of insects, lived the Hydra. This was a serpent of terrifying complexity. It had a massive body and 9 heads, some say 50, others 100, and its breath was a poison so potent that it could kill a man from a distance. Even the tracks the Hydra left in the mud were lethal to the touch. Heracles did not go alone this time. He took his nephew, Iolaus, the son of his brother Iphicles. Iolaus was a youth of great loyalty and quick mind, and he would prove essential in the battle against the multi-headed horror. They reached the swamp and used flaming arrows to force the Hydra out of its lair. As the monster emerged, its heads swaying like a field of tall, deadly grass, Heracles attacked with his club. He smashed one of the heads into a pulp, but as he did, a horrifying realization dawned. For every head he crushed, 2 more grew back in its place. The Hydra was a creature of exponential growth, a monster that thrived on the very violence used to destroy it. To make matters worse, Hera, watching from above, sent a giant crab to nip at Heracles' heels, trying to distract him so the Hydra could deliver a killing strike. Heracles crushed the crab under his foot. Hera would later place it in the stars as the constellation Cancer. But the Hydra was winning. It was then that Iolaus had an idea. As Heracles severed a head, Iolaus would take a flaming torch and sear the stump with fire. The heat cauterized the wound, preventing the new heads from sprouting. One by one, they worked their way through the nightmare. The central head, which was said to be immortal, was finally cut off and buried deep under a heavy rock on the road to Ilios. Before he left the swamp, Heracles performed an act that would have long-lasting consequences. He dipped his arrows into the black, poisonous gall of the Hydra. From that moment on, the slightest scratch from one of his arrows was a death sentence, an agonizing end that even gods could not endure. However, when he returned to Tiryns, Eurystheus found a legal loophole. He claimed that because Iolaus had helped him, the labor did not count toward the original 10. The hero said nothing. He simply waited for the next task. The third labor was a test of endurance and respect for the natural world. Eurystheus commanded him to bring back the Ceryneian hind. Boo, this was no ordinary deer. It was a creature sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. It had golden antlers and hooves of bronze, and it was said to be so fast that it could outrun an arrow in flight. It had never been caught, and it was the pride of the virgin goddess. Heracles knew that he could not kill the animal, for to do so would be to invite the wrath of Artemis. He had to capture it alive. For an entire year, he tracked the hind across the hills of Greece, through the forests of Arcadia, and even to the northern lands of the Hyperboreans. It was a chase that required a patience that was as vast as the sea. He followed the golden glimmer through the snow and the rain, never losing sight, but never close enough to strike. Finally, as the hind paused to drink from the river Ladon, Heracles loosed an arrow. He did not aim for the heart. He aimed for the thin membrane between the bone and the tendon of the forelegs, pinning the animal's legs together without spilling a drop of its sacred blood. As he carried the deer back on his shoulders, he was confronted by Artemis and her brother Apollo. The goddess was furious that her pet had been touched by a mortal. Heracles, showing the wisdom he had gained through suffering, did not boast. He bowed his head and explained his plight. He told them of the madness, the murders, and the command of Eurystheus. He placed the blame on the king and the fates. Artemis, moved by the hero's humility and his obvious respect for the animal, allowed him to take the hind to Tiryns, provided he promised to release it once it had been seen by the herald. Heracles gave his word, and the third labor was completed. The fourth labor took him into the high, winter-locked mountains of Erymanthus. A massive wild boar, a beast of such fury that it uprooted trees and killed anything that crossed its path, was terrorizing the region. Heracles was commanded to bring it back alive. On his way to the mountain, he stopped to visit a centaur named Pholus. Unlike many of his kind, Pholus was kind and hospitable. He offered Heracles cooked meat, though he ate his own raw. But tragedy struck when they opened a jar of wine that was the communal property of all the centaurs. The scent of the wine, rich and ancient, carried through the thin mountain air. The other centaurs, wild and easily maddened by drink, smelled the vintage and descended on the cave in a violent frenzy. A battle broke out. Heracles, forced to defend himself, used his poisoned arrows. The centaurs fled, but in the chaos, a tragic accident occurred. A poisoned arrow struck Chiron, the wisest and most immortal of the centaurs, the tutor of heroes. Chiron could not die, but the pain of the Hydra's venom was unbearable. In the same skirmish, Pholus, curiously examining one of the arrows, dropped it on his foot. The poison acted instantly, and the kind host fell dead. Heracles was heartbroken. He had come to cleanse his soul, yet death seemed to follow him like a shadow. He eventually found the Erymanthian boar. Using the deep snow of the high ridges to his advantage, he chased the beast until it was exhausted and trapped in a snowbank. He bound it with thick ropes and carried the thrashing monster all the way back to Tiryns. When he arrived, Eurystheus was so terrified by the sight of the tusks and the fury of the boar that he once again dove into his bronze jar, peering over the rim with wide, trembling eyes. Heracles stood outside the city walls, the boar on his shoulders and the pelt of the lion on his back. He had completed 4 tasks. He had faced the invulnerable, the undying, the impossible, and the wild. He was becoming the champion of the world, but the weight of his own heart was still as heavy as the stone of Athena. He looked toward the west, toward the next command, knowing that each labor was a step away from the man he had been, and a step closer to the glory that Hera had unintentionally promised him. The path was long, the air was cold, and the giants were waiting. The 5th labor appointed to the hero by King Eurystheus was designed to be a profound humiliation, a task that sought to strip away the dignity of the champion and reduce him to the level of a common laborer. Eurystheus, still hiding in his bronze jar at the mere mention of the hero's return, ordered Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day. Augeas was the ruler of Elis, a wealthy king who possessed the largest herds of cattle, goats, and horses in all of Greece, a gift from his father, the sun god Helios. Inside the massive stable complex, over 3,000 immortal cattle had lived for 30 years without the waste ever being removed. The resulting mountain of reeking dung was so vast that it could be seen from a great distance, and the stench was said to permeate the entire region, threatening the people with disease. Heracles arrived in Elis and, displaying a strategic wisdom that complemented his divine strength, he did not immediately set to work with a shovel. Instead, he proposed a wager to King Augeas. He offered to clean the entire stable complex in one day if the king would reward him with 1/10 of his magnificent livestock. Augeas, believing such a feat to be physically impossible, agreed to the terms, and the king's son, Phyleus, was called to witness the agreement. Heracles then walked to the walls of the stables. Rather than entering the filth, he used his massive strength to break 2 large breaches in the stone foundations. He then traveled to the banks of the nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. With precise and calculated movements, he dug channels that diverted the entire force of these 2 powerful currents toward the stables. The rushing waters, symbolizing the transformative power of natural renewal, swept through the stalls and courtyards, washing away decades of corruption and stagnant waste in a matter of hours. By the time the sun began to set, the stables were spotless, and the rivers were returned to their natural courses. However, King Augeas, discovering that Heracles was performing the task under the orders of Eurystheus, refused to honor the wager. A court was convened, and Phileus, choosing the path of justice over loyalty to his father, testified that the promise had indeed been made. Enraged, Augeas banished both Heracles and his own son from the kingdom. When Heracles returned to Tiryns, Eurystheus also chose to invalidate the labor, claiming that it did not count because Heracles had demanded payment for his work. Despite the political betrayal, the hero had demonstrated that his greatness extended beyond brute force. He had harnessed the elements themselves to bring order to a place of chaos. For the sixth labor, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to travel to the town of Stymphalos in the mountains of northeastern Arcadia. High in the crags lay Lake Stymphalos, a body of water surrounded by a dark and dense wood that served as a refuge for an enormous flock of monstrous birds. These were the pets of Ares, the god of war, and they were the terror of the countryside. The Stymphalian birds were man-eating creatures with beaks, claws, and wings made of bronze. They possessed the terrifying ability to launch their metallic feathers like arrows at their victims, and their toxic dung destroyed crops and fruit trees across the land. Heracles reached the lake and found that the ground was a treacherous marsh, unable to support his weight and preventing him from reaching the birds' nests. As he stood on the shore, contemplating how to flush the monsters into the open air, he received aid from the goddess Athena. She brought him a set of bronze crotala, or castanets, which had been forged by the master craftsman Hephaestus, specifically for this purpose. Heracles climbed a nearby mountain that overhung the dark water and clashed the castanets together with a divine resonance. The sharp, rhythmic noise terrified the birds, forcing them to take flight from the shadows of the wood. As the sky grew dark with metallic wings, Heracles used his bow to shoot them down, one by one, using arrows that had been dipped in the poisonous blood of the Hydra. The surviving birds fled far across the sea to the island of Aretius, where the Argonauts would later encounter them, and the region of Arcadia was finally at peace. The seventh labor took the hero across the sea to the island of Crete, a journey that marked the transition from his local Peloponnesian deeds to more exotic and distant challenges. Eurystheus ordered him to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent and wild beast that was ravaging the island's vineyards and fields. The origins of the bull were rooted in a divine dispute. King Minos of Crete had prayed to Poseidon for a bull to appear from the sea as a sign of his right to rule, promising to sacrifice it in return. When a splendid white bull emerged from the waves, Minos was so struck by its beauty that he kept it for his own herds and sacrificed a lesser animal instead. Poseidon, angered by this neglect of the sacred covenant, drove the bull into a violent madness, and it became a source of terror for the Cretan people. Heracles arrived on the island and sought permission from King Minos to take the beast, which the king granted willingly, being eager to be rid of the creature. Heracles approached the bull, and, through a combination of divine endurance and overwhelming physical presence, he wrestled the animal into submission. He did not kill the bull. He bound it and brought it back across the sea to Tiryns on his shoulders. After showing the captured beast to Eurystheus, the hero set it free, and the animal wandered across Greece until it eventually reached the plains of Marathon, where it would later be dealt with by the hero Theseus. This task served to emphasize the hero's superiority over the untamed forces of nature, and his role in preparing the world for human civilization. For the eighth labor, Heracles was sent to the harsh and frozen lands of Thrace, a region associated with barbarism and the bloodier aspects of existence. His task was to capture the man-eating mares of King Diomedes, the son of Ares and Cyrene. Diomedes ruled over the warlike tribe of the Bistones and kept a herd of 4 magnificent but savage horses: Podargos, the swift; Lampon, the shining; Xanthos, the blonde; and Danos, the terrible. These mares were kept in the city of Tyrrhida, fastened with iron chains to bronze mangers, and were fed an unnatural diet consisting of the flesh of unsuspecting guests and strangers who crossed the king's borders. Heracles sailed to Thrace with a group of volunteers, including his young and favored companion, Abderus, the son of Hermes. They successfully overpowered the grooms at the stables and drove the mares toward the sea. However, the Bistones soon arrived in force to reclaim their king's property. Heracles, needing to join the battle, entrusted the savage horses to the care of Abderus. Tragically, the youth was unable to control the man-eating beasts, and while Heracles was fighting the Thracian army, the mares turned on Abderus and devoured him. When Heracles returned and found the remains of his friend, his grief transformed into a cold and absolute justice. He sought out Diomedes, defeated him, and fed the king to his own horses. Having satisfied their unnatural hunger with the flesh of the man who had taught them to violate the laws of humanity, the mares became permanently calm and docile. Heracles founded the city of Abdera near his friend's tomb to honor his memory, before leading the mares back to Tiryns. Eurystheus, following his established pattern of fear and consecration, eventually released the horses on Mount Olympus, where they were reportedly destroyed by wild beasts or wolves. Through this eighth labor, Heracles had moved from domesticating the wild creatures of Greece to confronting the moral decay of distant lands, proving that his path of atonement was also a path of establishing justice in the darkest corners of the world. He had stood against the man-eating terror of Thrace and emerged with a heavier heart but a clearer purpose, as the final and most cosmic trials began to appear on the horizon. As the seasons turned over the rugged landscapes of the Peloponnese, the hero, known as Heracles, found that his soul was beginning to harden, much like the bronze of his weapons or the impenetrable hide of the lion he wore upon his back. The first 4 labors had tested his stamina, his speed, and his ability to face the physical manifestations of divine anger. But King Eurystheus, watching from the safety of his shadowed palace in Tiryns, realized that mere physical danger was not enough to break the spirit of the son of Zeus. To truly humble a hero of such celestial lineage, one had to attack his dignity. One had to drag his name through the mire of common toil and reduce his legendary strength to the service of filth. Thus, the 5th labor was devised, not as a duel with a monster, but as a struggle against the accumulated corruption of decades. Eurystheus commanded Heracles to travel to the kingdom of Elis in the western Peloponnese and clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day. To the ears of a warrior, this was a command of profound insult. It was a task intended to be both impossible and degrading, a labor that offered no glory, only the stench of waste and the mockery of a king. Augeas was no ordinary ruler. He was the son of Helios, the sun god who drove the golden chariot across the heavens each day, and from his father he had inherited herds of cattle, that were as vast as the clouds and as healthy as the immortals. These 3,000 cattle were divinely protected from disease and infertility. But this blessing carried a dark consequence. For 30 long years, the stables that housed these magnificent beasts had never been cleaned. The waste had built up into a mountain of stagnant, reeking filth that smothered the fertile plains of Elys, poisoning the air and rendering the land around the palace a wasteland of rot. Heracles approached the palace of Augeas, the smell of the stables reaching him long before he saw the walls. It was a scent that spoke of ancient neglect, a heavy, humid vapor that seemed to coat the throat and sting the eyes. But the hero did not let his disgust show. He stood before the king, and, with a subtle wisdom that Eurystheus had not anticipated, he proposed a wager. He did not mention that he was there under the orders of tyrants. Instead, he offered to clean the entire complex in a single day, if Augeas would grant him 1/10 of his divine herd as payment. Augeas, looking at the sheer scale of the waste and believing that even a god could not move such a mountain in 1,000 years, laughed. He agreed to the terms, and his son, the noble Phyleus, was called to stand as a witness to the oath. The king thought he was gaining free labor and a chance to humiliate a famous hero. He did not realize that Heracles was looking not at the filth, but at the landscape itself. The hero walked away from the stables and climbed a nearby ridge that overlooked the valley. He stood in the silence of the morning, watching the paths of 2 great rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, as they wound through the hills like silver serpents. He did not pick up a shovel. He did not call for servants. He began to move the very earth. With his bare hands, he tore massive breaches in the walls of the stables, opening them to the valley. Then, traveling upstream, he used his strength to shift the boulders and the soil, digging a new channel that diverted the combined force of both rivers directly toward the breaches he had made. The sound that followed was like 1,000 chariots charging across the plain. The water, cold and relentless, surged through the new passage, hitting the stables with the force of a tidal wave. The rivers, agents of natural purity, did in hours what 1,000 men could not do in a lifetime. They swept through the stalls, the courtyards, and the lower pastures, washing away the 30 years of corruption and carrying the filth far out to sea. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the ground of the stables was scoured clean, the stone floors shining as if they were new, and the air over Elis was fresh for the first time in a generation. Heracles returned the rivers to their natural beds and stood before Augeas to claim his reward. But the king had discovered the truth, that Heracles was performing this task as a labor for Eurystheus. Using this as a pretext, Augeas reneged on his promise, denying that a wager had ever been made. A court was held, and Phyleus, the king's own son, stepped forward. Possessing a sense of justice that outweighed his loyalty to a deceptive father, Phyleus testified in favor of the hero. Enraged, Augeas banished both Heracles and Phyleus from his kingdom. When Heracles returned to Tiryns, he found that Eurystheus was equally deceptive. The king claimed the labor did not count, arguing that the rivers had done the work and that Heracles had sought payment, violating the nature of his servitude. The hero said nothing. He carried the anger in his heart, a cold ember that would one day erupt into a war against Elis, a conflict that would eventually lead to the foundation of the Olympic Games in honor of Zeus. For now, he simply prepared for the next trial. his body still smelling faintly of the river water and the ancient dust. The sixth labor took him deep into the heart of Arcadia, to the city of Stymphalos. The region was dominated by a vast, dark lake, surrounded by a forest so dense that the sun rarely touched the water. This eerie landscape was the home of the Stymphalian birds, monstrous creatures that had been raised by Ares, the god of war. They were a nightmare of metal and flesh, possessing beaks, claws, and wings made of bronze. Their feathers were like serrated knives, and they had the terrifying ability to launch them from the sky like a rain of arrows. They had descended upon the lake in such numbers that they darkened the sky, their toxic droppings poisoning the land, and their bronze beaks feasting upon the flesh of the local people. When Heracles arrived, he found that he could not approach the birds. The ground around the lake was a treacherous, shifting marsh that would swallow a man in armor, and the woods were so thick that a bow was useless. He stood on the shore, the metallic screeching of the birds echoing through the trees, feeling for the first time the limits of his strength. You cannot wrestle a cloud of birds. You cannot club a shadow. It was then that he felt a presence beside him. Athena, the goddess of the gray eyes, had not forgotten her champion. She appeared not as a warrior, but as a guide, and she handed him a pair of bronze crotala, massive castanets or rattles that had been forged in the subterranean fires of Hephaestus. Athena whispered the strategy into his ear and vanished. Heracles climbed a high rocky spur that overhung the lake. He stood at the edge of the precipice and began to clash the bronze crotala together. The sound was not a mere noise. It was a divine resonance, a sharp, clanging vibration that seemed to tear through the silence of the marsh and vibrate in the very bones of the monsters. Terrified by the unnatural sound, the thousands of birds rose from the trees in a single, chaotic explosion of bronze wings. The sky turned to the color of tarnished metal as the birds circled in a panic. Heracles, his bow now ready, began to shoot. Each arrow, tipped with the lethal venom of the Hydra, found its mark. The birds fell from the sky like heavy stones, their bronze plumage clattering against the rocks. The massacre continued until the surface of the lake was covered in the remains of Ares's pets. The survivors, broken and scattered, fled across the sea to the island of Aretias, never to return to Greece. The people of Stymphalos emerged from their homes, and the hero moved on, the sound of the bronze rattles still ringing in his ears. The seventh labor took the hero across the foaming tides of the Mediterranean to the island of Crete. This was a journey into a land of ancient mysteries and divine curses. King Eurystheus had commanded him to capture the Cretan bull, a creature that embodied the untamed fury of the sea and the weight of a broken promise. The history of the bull was a story of human greed and divine retribution. King Minos of Crete, seeking to prove his divine right to rule, had prayed to Poseidon to send a sign. The god of the sea had caused a magnificent, snow-white bull to rise from the waves, with the understanding that it would be sacrificed back to him. But Minos, captivated by the animal's beauty and strength, kept it for his own herds and sacrificed a lesser beast in its place. Poseidon, never one to let an insult go unpunished, drove the bull into a violent, earth-shaking madness. It was this same bull that had played a role in the tragic and monstrous birth of the Minotaur, and now it wandered Crete, a white storm of muscle and horn that leveled villages and trampled the sacred vineyards. Heracles arrived in Crete and sought out King Minos. The king, exhausted by the destruction the bull had caused, gave Heracles full permission to take the animal, though he offered no help. The hero tracked the beast to a coastal plain where the grass was scorched by the bull's hot breath. As the animal charged, its hooves striking the earth with the force of an earthquake, Heracles did not use a weapon. He met the charge head-on. The struggle was a symphony of primal power. Heracles grabbed the bull by its massive curving horns, his muscles straining until they looked like the roots of an ancient oak. The bull thrashed, trying to gash the hero with its horns and crush him with its weight, but Heracles held fast. He used the leverage of his divine strength to twist the bull's head, forcing the great beast to its knees. He did not kill the animal. He bound it with thick ropes, and, in an act of staggering endurance, he swam with the bull all the way back from Crete to the shores of the Peloponnese. When he arrived in Tiryns and led the white bull to the gates, Eurystheus was so overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the animal that he hid in his bronze jar for 3 days. He wished to sacrifice the bull to Hera, but the Queen of Heaven refused the offering, knowing that it would only further the glory of her stepson. Instead, the bull was set free. It wandered across the lands of Greece, eventually reaching Marathon, where it would continue its reign of terror until it met its end at the hands of the young hero Theseus. But for Heracles, the labor was done. He had tamed the sea's fury and brought order to the island of the labyrinth. The 8th labor was perhaps the most visceral and haunting of his middle trials, taking him to the wild and barbaric lands of Thrace. Eurystheus commanded him to bring back the man-eating mares of King Diomedes. Diomedes was a son of Ares, and he ruled over the Bistones with a cruelty that was legendary, even in those harsh northern lands. He kept 4 magnificent horses, Podargos, Lampon, Xanthos, and Deinos, chained to bronze mangers with iron links. Their madness was not a natural occurrence. They were fed on a diet of human flesh, the bodies of unsuspecting guests and shipwrecked sailors who wandered into the king's territory. Heracles sailed to Thrace with a band of loyal volunteers, including his young and beloved companion, Abderus. They moved with the silence of hunters, infiltrating the stables and overpowering the grooms before the king could raise the alarm. They broke the iron chains and began to drive the mares toward the coast. However, the Bistones were a warlike people, and Diomedes soon pursued them with a massive army. Heracles, realizing that a battle was inevitable, entrusted the care of the mares to Abderus while he turned to face the advancing Thracian host. The battle was a bloody affair, fought on the edge of the Gray Sea. Heracles moved through the Bistonian ranks like a whirlwind, his club shattering shields and his presence breaking the will of the warriors. He eventually captured Diomedes himself, dragging the tyrant from his chariot. But when Heracles returned to the shore, he found a scene of absolute horror. The mares, sensing the youth's vulnerability and driven by their unnatural hunger, had turned on Abderus. The young man, the son of Hermes and the friend of the hero, had been torn to pieces and devoured by the beasts. Heracles stood over the remains of his companion, his grief transforming into a cold, focused rage. He did not execute Diomedes with a sword. He took the living king and threw him into the bronze mangers of his own horses. The mares, recognizing their master, but governed by the hunger he had cultivated in them, devoured him. Once they had tasted the flesh of the man who had corrupted them, a strange and miraculous change occurred. Their madness vanished, and they became as docile as lambs. Heracles founded the city of Abdera over the tomb of his friend, marking the land with a permanent monument to his sorrow. He then led the mares back to Tiryns. They were so peaceful now that they required no chains. Eurystheus, as was his custom, eventually released them on Mount Olympus, where they were said to have been destroyed by the wild beasts of the high peaks. The hero had completed 8 of his tasks. He had moved through the filth of the earth, the shadows of the sky, the mysteries of the sea, and the barbarism of the north. He was no longer the young man who had notched his bow in a fit of madness. He was a figure of tragic weight, a man whose hands had cleaned the world and yet were stained with the blood of his friends. He looked toward the horizon, where the final, most terrifying labors waited, knowing that each victory was a step closer to the end of his penance, and a step further into the silence of the legends. As the hero moved further into his years of penance, the nature of his tasks began to shift. No longer was he merely clearing the Peloponnese of local pests or wrestling the wild beasts of the Greek hills. King Eurystheus, growing more desperate as Heracles returned time and again with the spoils of impossible victories, decided to send him into the realms of myth and the very edges of the known map. The 9th labor would lead the hero across the Euxine Sea, into the lands of the legendary Amazons, a tribe of warrior women who lived on the fringes of the world near the Thermodon River. The command was specific. Heracles was to bring back the golden belt of Hippolyte, the queen of the Amazons. This was not a belt of mere fashion. It was a zoster, a war belt given to her by her father, Ares, the god of war. It was the symbol of her authority, her military prowess, and her divine right to lead the fiercest army of women the ancient world had ever seen. Eurystheus did not want the belt for himself. He wanted it as a gift for his daughter, Admete, who coveted the legendary artifact. Heracles did not travel alone. He gathered a small but formidable fleet of volunteers, including his friend Theseus, the future king of Athens. They sailed through the Bosporus and into the vast gray reaches of the Black Sea, eventually reaching the harbor of Themyscira. To the surprise of the Greeks, Hippolyte did not meet them with arrows or spears. She rode out to meet the hero on the shore, her presence commanding, and her eyes reflecting the wisdom of a queen who had seen many battles. The conversation that took place on the sands of the Black Sea was one of mutual respect. Heracles explained his plight, the madness, the murders, the long years of service to a man he despised. Hippolyte, moved by the hero's tragic burden and recognizing the divine fire in his eyes, agreed to give him the belt freely. It was a rare moment of diplomacy in a life defined by violence, a testament to the idea that even the greatest warriors value peace when it is offered with honor. But Hera, watching from the clouds of Olympus, could not allow a victory so clean and bloodless. She knew that if Heracles returned with the belt without a struggle, his glory would be too easy. Taking the form of an Amazon warrior, the queen of the gods ran through the streets of Themyscira, shouting that the strangers were kidnapping their queen. The Amazons, a people defined by their protective loyalty, donned their armor and seized their crescent shields. They charged toward the harbor on horseback, a whirlwind of bronze and fury. Heracles, seeing the sudden attack and believing that Hippolyte had betrayed him, acted with the tragic speed of a man who had been hurt too many times. In the chaos and the dust of the shore, he drew his sword and slew the queen. He stripped the belt from her cooling body as her warriors descended upon them. A massive, bloody battle ensued, a clash of civilizations that left the sands soaked in crimson. By the time the Greeks fought their way back to their ships, the peace had been shattered forever. Heracles sailed away with the belt, but his heart was heavy with the weight of another needless death. He had the prize, but the cost was the life of a queen who had intended to be his friend. For the 10th labor, Eurystheus sent the hero even further west, to the very limits of the sunset. He was commanded to bring back the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a monster of staggering complexity, a giant born from the union of Chrysaor and Caliro. He was described as having 3 bodies joined at the waist, 3 heads, 6 arms, and 6 legs. He ruled over the island of Erythea, a place of perpetual twilight located in the middle of the ocean, near the modern coast of Spain. The journey to the west was a labor in itself. Heracles traveled through the burning deserts of North Africa, the heat of the sun pressing down on him like a physical weight. At one point, frustrated by the relentless glare of Helios, the hero grew so enraged that he notched an arrow and aimed it at the sun god himself. Helios, instead of punishing the hero, was so impressed by his audacity and his sheer will that he granted him a unique gift, a massive golden cup. This cup was the vessel Helios used to sail back across the ocean each night from west to east. Heracles used the divine cup as a boat, crossing the vast Atlantic waters until he reached the misty shores of Erythea. Upon landing, he was immediately confronted by Orthrus, the 2-headed dog and brother of Cerberus, who guarded Geryon's herds. With a single blow of his club, Heracles silenced the beast. He then faced the giant herdsman Eurytion, who met the same fate. Finally, Geryon himself appeared, his 3 bodies armored in bronze, and his 3 shields overlapping like the scales of a serpent. The battle was a test of precision and power. Heracles loosed an arrow that pierced through all 3 of the giant's bodies, ending the monster's life and securing the cattle. The journey back was a long and arduous trek across Europe. It was during this return trip that Heracles performed some of his most famous secondary deeds. He broke through the mountains that blocked his path, creating the Strait of Gibraltar, and leaving behind the 2 massive promontories known to the ancients as the Pillars of Hercules. In Italy, he faced the fire-breathing giant Cacus, who stole some of the cattle and dragged them into a cave by their tails to hide their tracks. Heracles, hearing the lowing of his stolen cows, found the cave and slew Cacus in a struggle that lit up the hills of what would one day be Rome. Finally, after surviving the stinging flies Hera sent to scatter the herd and the floods that threatened to drown them, Heracles brought the cattle to Tiryns. Eurystheus sacrificed the entire herd to Hera, yet the goddess remained unsatisfied. The hero had completed 10 labors, but the king, under Hera's influence, claimed that 2 did not count. The stables because he had asked for pay, and the Hydra because Iolaus had helped him. Thus, the original 10 were extended to 12. The 11th labor was perhaps the most mystical of all, the retrieval of the golden apples of the Hesperides. These apples were a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera, and they were kept in a sacred garden at the northernmost edge of the world, guarded by the Hesperides, the daughters of night, and a 100-headed dragon named Ladon that never slept. Heracles did not know where the garden was. He wandered through the lands of the world, seeking information. He wrestled the sea god Nereus, a master of shape-shifting, holding on to the god even as he turned into fire, water, and a lion, until Nereus finally revealed the location. Along his path, Heracles reached the Caucasus Mountains, where he found the Titan Prometheus chained to a rock, his liver being eternally devoured by an eagle as punishment for giving fire to humanity. Heracles, moved by the Titan's suffering and his immense wisdom, shot the eagle with a poisoned arrow and broke the chains of Prometheus, freeing the firebringer at last. In gratitude, Prometheus gave the hero a crucial piece of advice: do not pick the apples yourself. Send Atlas. Heracles eventually reached the place where Atlas, the Titan who had led the war against the gods, stood condemned to hold the weight of the celestial sphere on his shoulders. The hero approached the giant and offered a deal. He would take the weight of the heavens if Atlas would go into the garden and retrieve 3 golden apples. Atlas, weary of the infinite burden, eagerly agreed. As Heracles stepped into the Titan's place, the weight of the universe settled onto his neck and shoulders. It was a weight that was not just physical. It was the pressure of the stars, the movement of the planets, and the cold silence of the void. For a brief moment, the son of Zeus became the pillar of the world. Atlas returned from the garden, holding the 3 shimmering apples, but the taste of freedom was too sweet. He told Heracles that he would deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself, leaving the hero to hold the sky forever. Heracles, showing a cunning that matched his strength, pretended to agree. "I will do it," he said, "but the weight is rubbing against my shoulders. Just take the sky back for a moment, so I can fold my lion skin into a pad for my neck." Atlas, possessing more brawn than wit, set the apples on the grass and took back the celestial sphere. The moment the weight was off him, Heracles picked up the apples and walked away, leaving the Titan to his eternal task. He had outwitted the oldest of the gods and secured the fruit of immortality. He returned to Tiryns and handed the apples to Eurystheus, who was so frightened of the sacred objects that he did not know what to do with them. Eventually, Athena took the apples and returned them to the garden, for they were too holy to remain in the world of men. The hero stood once again before the gates of the city. He had traveled to the ends of the earth, he had held the sky, and he had freed the mind of man. Only one task remained, the most terrifying of all. He was to descend into the land of the dead and face the master of the shadows himself. The air around the gates of Tiryns felt thin and brittle, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the final command. 10 labors had passed, then 11, and the hero who stood before the bronze-bound gates was no longer the man who had first stepped into the service of Eurystheus. He was a figure of weathered stone and quiet thunder, his eyes reflecting the vastness of the deserts he had crossed and the cold heights of the heavens he had held. King Eurystheus, paralyzed by a fear that had turned into a form of madness, decided that if the world of the living could not kill the son of Zeus, then the world of the dead surely would. The final labor was not a hunt, nor a cleaning, nor a retrieval of gold. It was a descent into the absolute dark. He was commanded to bring back Cerberus, the hound of Hades, from the very bowels of the underworld. To the ancient Greeks, the journey to the land of the dead was the ultimate boundary. It was the place from which no mortal returned, a realm of shadows where the rules of the sun and the moon did not apply. Heracles, understanding the gravity of this task, did not rush blindly into the abyss. He knew that to enter the house of Hades, one needed more than just strength. One needed the sanction of the gods and the purification of the spirit. He traveled first to the sacred village of Eleusis, the center of the great mysteries. There, under the guidance of the priests of Demeter and Persephone, he underwent the rituals of initiation. He was washed in the cold waters of the Olympus. He fasted, and he listened to the secret chants that explained the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. He was being prepared not just to fight a monster, but to witness the architecture of the soul. With the blessing of the mysteries and accompanied by the shadows of Hermes, the messenger who guides souls, and Athena, his eternal guardian, Heracles sought the entrance to the underworld. He traveled to the southernmost tip of the Peloponnese, to the dark, cavernous maw of Cape Tainaron. The air here was heavy with the smell of sulfur and the ancient dampness of the earth. As he descended, the light of the upper world faded into a sickly gray twilight. The sound of the wind was replaced by the low, rhythmic pulsing of the earth's own heart, and the further he went, the more the silence began to speak. He reached the banks of the river Styx, the river of hatred that binds the underworld in 9 loops. The ferryman, Charon, a figure of skeletal thinness with eyes that burned like dying coals, initially refused to take a living man across the water. But the hero did not argue. He simply looked at the ferryman with the weight of his destiny. In some accounts, Heracles used his strength to force Charon to row him across. In others, the sight of the Nemean Lion skin, a trophy from a beast that defied death, was enough to silence the old man's objections. As the boat moved through the black, oily water, the screams of the unburied dead echoed from the mists, a sound like dry leaves skittering across marble. Upon reaching the other side, the hero stood in the meadows of Asphodel, a place of gray grass and eternal stillness. Here he encountered the ghosts of his past. The shade of Medusa appeared, her snaky locks still writhing in the dim light. But Heracles, remembering the advice of Hermes, did not strike. He knew she was but a phantom of air and memory. Then he saw the ghost of Meleager, the great hero of the Caledonian boar hunt. Meleager looked at the son of Zeus with a profound, aching sadness. They spoke of the vanity of glory and the cruelty of the fates. Meleager, weeping for the sister he had left behind in the world of light, Deianira, asked Heracles to find her and marry her. This meeting, in the silence of the dead, would set the stage for the final act of the hero's life, a promise made in the dark that would lead to his ultimate end. As he moved deeper into the realm of shadows, toward the palace of Hades and Persephone, he found 2 figures trapped in the chair of forgetfulness. These were Theseus, the king of Athens, and his friend Pirithous. They had descended to the underworld in a foolish attempt to kidnap Persephone herself. For their hubris, they had been fused into the stone of the chairs, their memories slowly dissolving into the gloom. Heracles, seeing his friend Theseus, reached out and, with a heave that shook the foundations of the underworld, tore him from the chair. Part of Theseus's flesh remained stuck to the stone, a physical mark of his punishment, but he was free. When Heracles tried to do the same for Pirithous, the earth groaned, and a wall of divine fire erupted between them. Pirithous, the mastermind of the crime, was destined to stay forever. Finally, Heracles stood before the throne of Hades. The king of the dead sat on a seat of polished obsidian, his face as cold and unyielding as a winter night. Beside him was Persephone, her beauty a sharp, painful contrast to the surrounding decay. Heracles did not demand. He did not boast. He bowed his head and explained his plight. He told the king of the dead that he was a servant of a coward, fulfilling a penance for a crime he had committed in madness. He asked for the hound, not as a prize, but as a proof of his labor. Hades, impressed by the hero's humility and the sheer audacity of his request, gave a condition. Heracles could take Cerberus, provided he could master the beast with his bare hands alone, using no weapons of iron or wood. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates of the palace. The hound was a nightmare made manifest. He had 3 massive heads, each with jaws that could crush the hull of a ship, and a mane made of writhing, venomous serpents. His tail was a living dragon, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. As the hero approached, the 3 heads let out a simultaneous roar, a sound that combined the howl of a wolf, the snarl of a lion, and the scream of a dying man. The serpents on the hound's neck hissed, their tongues flickering toward the hero's face. Heracles lunged. He wrapped his massive arms around the center neck of the beast, his fingers digging into the thick, matted fur. The hound fought with a primal fury, clawing at the hero's chest and lashing out with its dragon tail. The serpents bit into Heracles' arms, their venom burning like liquid fire. But the hero was protected by the Nemean pelt and the sheer force of his will. He squeezed, channeling the strength that had once held the sky. He choked the beast, not to kill it, but to break its spirit. Slowly, the thrashing stopped. The roars turned to whimpers, and the 3 heads of the terrifying guardian sank toward the earth in submission. The journey back to the upper world was a triumph of the living over the dead. As Heracles led the 3-headed dog through the caverns and back to the sunlight, the beast was so terrified by the glare of the sun that its poisonous saliva dripped onto the ground. From this divine poison, the plant known as aconite, or monkshood, first grew. When the hero arrived at the gates of Tiryns, the sight was more than Eurystheus could bear. The king did not even stay to verify the task. He dove into his bronze jar and stayed there for weeks, screaming for the hero to take the monster back where it belonged. Heracles, his 12 years of service finally complete, led the hound back to the gates of Tyneron and released it. Cerberus vanished into the shadows, a dark memory returning to the dark. But the hero was not yet at peace. The blood guilt was washed away, yet the restlessness of his spirit remained. It was during this period, between his labors and his final marriage, that he joined the greatest gathering of heroes the world had ever seen, the Argonauts. Under the leadership of Jason, 50 of the finest warriors of Greece sailed the ship Argo in search of the Golden Fleece. Heracles was the greatest among them, a mountain of a man who sat at the center of the rowing bench. It was said that whenever he pulled his oar, the ship moved like an arrow, and no other 2 men combined could match the power of his stroke. However, the hero's journey with the Argonauts was cut short by a tragedy of the heart. He had brought with him a young squire and companion named Hylas. Hylas was a youth of extraordinary beauty, and Heracles loved him with a devotion that was both protective and profound. When the Argo stopped at the coast of Mysia to replenish their water and wood, Hylas went alone to a spring in the forest. The nymphs of the spring, captivated by the boy's beauty, reached up from the water and pulled him down into the depths. Hylas vanished without a trace, his cries unheard by anyone but the trees. When Heracles realized that Hylas was missing, he went into a frenzy of grief that mirrored his ancient madness. He forgot the quest, he forgot the Golden Fleece, and he forgot Jason and the ship. He ran through the forests of Mysia, his voice echoing through the hills as he called the name of the boy. Hylas! Hylas! The cry was so desolate and so powerful that it is said the local people still repeat it to this day as a ritual lament. The Argo, unable to wait any longer, was forced to sail away, leaving the greatest hero behind in the wild. Heracles never found the boy. He wandered the land for a long time, a figure of solitary sorrow, before eventually returning to the world of men. This loss served as a reminder that for all his strength, for all his victories over monsters and gods, he could not protect the things he loved from the whims of the world. He was a man destined for greatness, but he was also a man destined for loneliness. In this same period of wandering, he performed another deed that highlighted his relationship with death. He visited the house of King Admetus, a friend who was in deep mourning. Admetus's wife, Alcestis, had offered her own life to save her husband from an early death, a sacrifice that the gods had accepted. When Heracles arrived, he found the house in silence, the people dressed in black. Initially unaware of the tragedy, he drank and sang. But when he discovered the truth, he was filled with a sense of noble shame. He did not pray for Alcestis to return. He did not offer a sacrifice. He walked to the tomb, where the body of the queen had just been placed. There, he waited in the shadows. When Thanatos, the personification of death itself, came to claim the soul of the queen, Heracles stepped out. He did not use his bow or his club. He wrestled death. He caught the skeletal winged figure in his grip and squeezed until death, terrified by the strength of the living man, agreed to release the soul. Heracles led Alcestis back to her husband. A silent, veiled figure returned from the brink. It was a victory that proved that while he could not save his own happiness, he could still be the champion of others. The hero had now completed his labors and proven his mastery over the physical, the mystical, and the dead. He was a figure of transition, a man who bridged the gap between the old world of monsters and the new world of kings. But the prophecy of Meleager was still waiting for him in the shadows. The name of Deianira was written in the stars, and the final chapter of his mortal life was beginning to turn. He looked toward the mountains of Aetolia, where the river god Achelous guarded the woman who would be his wife, and the fire that would be his end. The air of the upper world, though bright with the gold of the sun and the silver of the stars, felt different to the hero after his return from the house of Hades. There is a weight that settles into the bones of a man who has looked into the eyes of death and returned with his soul intact. Heracles was no longer a servant of tyrants. His 12 years of penance were complete, and the shadow of his crimes had been lifted by the divine authority of the Labors. Yet, the heart of a hero is rarely allowed to remain still. He carried with him a promise, a whisper from the gray meadows of the underworld that echoed in his mind like the tolling of a distant bell. He remembered the shade of Meleager, the fallen prince of Calydon, and the tears that had stained the ghostly face of a warrior. "Find my sister, Deianira," Meleager had pleaded. "Protect her, marry her." Heracles traveled to the kingdom of Aetolia, to the city of Pleuron, where King Oeneus held court. The landscape here was defined by the movement of water. The great river Achelous wound through the plains like a muscular serpent, its currents ancient and unpredictable. As the hero approached the palace, he found that he was not the only suitor for the hand of the princess Deianira. The daughter of Oeneus was a woman of extraordinary spirit, a creature of the wild, who knew how to drive a chariot and draw a bow, and she had attracted the attention of a being far older and more powerful than any mortal prince. The rival was Achelous himself, the god of the river. To the ancient Greeks, a river god was not merely a spirit. He was the river. He was the flood that destroyed the crops, the silt that nourished the soil, and the hidden depths that swallowed the unwary. Heracles was a master of transformation, a shapeshifter who could inhabit the forms of the natural world with terrifying ease. He had demanded Deianira as his bride, and the princess lived in a state of constant, trembling fear, watching the waters of the river rise toward her father's walls. Sophocles, in his profound tragedy, The Trachiniae, describes Deianira's terror with a visceral clarity. She watched from the high windows as the river god appeared in 3 distinct forms to woo her. First as a bull with massive, earth-shaking hooves, then as a shimmering, speckled serpent that coiled around the pillars of the hall, and finally as a man with the head of an ox, water dripping from the thick mats of his beard. To her, this was not a marriage. It was a drowning. When Heracles arrived, he did not offer poems or gold. He offered his strength as a barrier between the girl and the god. He stood on the banks of the river, the Nemean Lion skin draped over his shoulders, and challenged the deity of the waters. The battle that followed was a clash of elements, a struggle between the stability of the earth and the fluidity of the water. It was a contest of pure, primal wrestling, where the stakes were the life of a woman and the pride of a god. Heracles, realizing that he could not match the hero's raw muscle in human form, began to shift. He turned into a massive, slippery serpent, trying to coil around Heracles' limbs and crush the breath from his lungs. But Heracles only laughed. He remembered the snakes he had strangled in his cradle when he was but 10 months old. He gripped the river god's throat with hands that had choked the life from the Hydra and the Nemean Lion. "I defeated the serpents of Hera when I was an infant," he roared. "Do you think a river snake can master me now?" Feeling the hero's grip tighten, Heracles shifted again. Taking the form of a ferocious bull, he charged with his head down, his horns aimed at the hero's heart. The earth groaned under the weight of the divine animal, but Heracles met the charge head-on. He seized the bull by its horns, digging his heels into the mud of the riverbank. With a surge of power that seemed to draw from the very core of the world, he twisted the bull's head and threw it to the ground. In the struggle, one of the bull's massive horns was snapped off, torn from the god's head by the hero's sheer force. Heracles, defeated and humbled, retreated into the depths of his waters. The broken horn, however, became a treasure of the world. In some versions of the myth, the naiads took the horn and filled it with the fragrant flowers and fruits of the earth, transforming it into the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, a symbol of eternal abundance. In other traditions, Heracles traded the horn back to the god in exchange for the horn of Amalthea. Regardless of the version, the victory was absolute. Heracles had tamed the river, and Deianira was free. The hero and the princess were married in a celebration that brought peace to Aetolia. For a time, it seemed that Heracles might finally settle into the life of a noble husband. Deianira was a devoted wife, and she bore him children, including a son named Hylas, who would carry his father's legacy. But the hero was a creature of movement, and his past was a long chain of debts and duties. They decided to leave the court of Oeneus and travel to the city of Trachis, seeking a new home and a fresh start. On their journey, they reached the river Evenus. The waters were swollen with the spring rains, the current a churning mass of brown foam and debris. There was no bridge, and the ford was dangerous. At the edge of the river stood a centaur named Nessus. He offered a service to travelers, claiming that the gods had appointed him as a ferryman because of his honesty. He offered to carry Deianira across the water on his broad, muscular back, while Heracles swam across. Heracles, trusting the laws of hospitality and the word of a fellow creature of the wild, agreed. He tossed his bow and his club across the river and dived into the current. He fought the rushing water with easy strokes, reaching the far bank and pulling himself onto the grass. But as he turned to look back, he heard a scream that tore through the sound of the river. Nessus had not been honest. Midway across the water, the centaur's primal instincts had overwhelmed him. He had tried to abduct Deianira, galloping toward the opposite shore with the intention of violating her. Heracles did not hesitate. He did not run back into the water, for the distance was too great. Instead, he reached for his bow. He notched an arrow, one of the many he had dipped in the black, immortal venom of the Lernaean Hydra. The bow groaned as he pulled it to its limit. The arrow hissed through the air, a streak of silent death that crossed the river in the blink of an eye. It struck Nessus in the back, the poisoned tip piercing his heart and emerging through his chest. The centaur stumbled and fell onto the muddy bank, his lifeblood pouring out into the grass. As Heracles began to swim back to his wife, the dying Nessus whispered to Deianira. It was a whisper of ultimate malice, a trap laid with the last breath of a monster. "Take some of my blood," the centaur wheezed, his voice bubbling with the venom of the Hydra. "It is a powerful love charm. If ever you fear that Heracles is losing his affection for you, if ever his eyes wander to another woman, take a garment and soak it in this blood. If he wears it, he will love you forever, and no other woman will ever take your place." Deianira, a woman whose life had been defined by the fear of losing the man she loved, believed him. She did not see the poison. She only saw a way to secure her happiness. She gathered some of the clotted, darkened blood into a small jar and hid it among her possessions, telling no one of the gift. She crossed the river to her husband's side, and they continued their journey to Trachis, the jar of blood, a silent, ticking heart of tragedy hidden in her robes. The years in Trachis were a period of deceptive calm. Heracles performed many deeds during this time. He fought the king of the Dryopians. He assisted the Dorians in their wars, and he continued to rid the world of local tyrants and thieves. But his heart was increasingly drawn to the city of Oechalia, where King Eurytus ruled. Eurytus had been the man who taught Heracles the art of the bow when he was a youth, but the king had grown arrogant and cruel. He had offered his daughter, the beautiful Iole, as a prize in an archery contest, promising her hand to any man who could outshoot him and his sons. Heracles had entered the contest and, as expected, had easily outperformed the king. But Eurytus, remembering the hero's past madness and the death of his children in Thebes, had refused to honor the promise. He had insulted the son of Zeus, calling him a slave and a murderer, and had driven him from the city. This was an insult that the hero could not forget. In his world, a broken oath was a violation of the cosmic order. While living in Trachis, the memory of Iole and the insult of Eurytus festered in his mind. He eventually gathered an army and marched on Oechalia. The siege was brutal, and the victory absolute. Heracles leveled the city, slew Eurytus and his sons, and took Iole as a captive. As he prepared to return home, he stopped at Cape Sinaeum to perform a sacrifice of thanksgiving to his father, Zeus. He sent a herald named Lycus back to Trachis to fetch a fine white tunic for the ritual. He wanted to stand before the gods in a garment of purity. When the herald arrived in Trachis and told Deianira of the victory, her heart was filled with a cold, creeping dread. She heard of the destruction of Oechalia, but more importantly, she heard of Iole. She saw the young princess among the captives, a woman of such radiant beauty and quiet dignity that Deianira knew her own position was threatened. She saw the way the messengers spoke of Heracles' interest in the girl. The fear that had lived in her since the day on the riverbank finally erupted. She remembered the words of the centaur Nessus. She remembered the jar of blood. In the silence of her chambers, Deianira took the white tunic that Lycus had come to fetch. She took the blood of the centaur, which had been darkened and thickened by the venom of the hydra over the years, and she carefully smeared it into the fabric of the robe. She did not know that she was painting the hero's shroud. She believed she was weaving a net of love that would pull him back to her hearth. She folded the tunic, placed it in a chest, and handed it to Lycus, giving him strict instructions that no one was to wear it before Heracles, and that it must not be touched by the sun or the heat of a fire until the moment of the sacrifice. Lycus returned to the hero at Cape Sinaeum. Heracles, pleased with the gift from his wife, took the tunic and put it on. He stood before the altar of Zeus, the sea breeze ruffling the white fabric, and prepared to light the sacrificial fires. The sun was high and hot, and as the hero began the ritual, the heat of his own body and the heat of the altar flames began to activate the poison. The venom of the hydra was not a simple toxin. It was an ancient, elemental force of destruction. As the tunic warmed against his skin, the blood of Nessus began to liquefy. The poison seeped into the pores of the hero's flesh, binding the fabric to his body as if it were a second skin. It was not a sudden pain, but a slow, agonizing realization. First came a prickling heat, then a burning that felt like liquid fire being poured over his limbs. Heracles tried to pull the tunic off, but the fabric was fused to his muscles. When he reached for the hem and tugged, he did not tear the cloth. He tore the flesh from his own bones. The screams that echoed across the cape were not the screams of a man. They were the sounds of a god's son being unmade. The venom was eating through his nerves, melting his veins, and turning his divine blood into a boiling acid. In his agony, the hero's mind once again touched the edges of madness. He saw the herald Lycus standing nearby, trembling with terror. Believing the man had knowingly brought him a poisoned gift, Heracles seized him by the ankles and swung him in a massive arc, casting him far out into the Euboean Sea. The poets say that Lycus turned to stone before he hit the water, becoming a group of small islands that bear his name to this day. Back in Trachis, Deianira discovered the truth too late. She had left a scrap of wool soaked in the centaur's blood in the courtyard, and as the sun hit it, the wool had dissolved into a bubbling, toxic foam that hissed as it consumed the stone. She realized then that Nessus had achieved his revenge from beyond the grave. She had not sent a love charm. She had sent a death sentence. Overwhelmed by a grief and a guilt that no mortal could endure, Deianira went into her bedchamber, took up a double-edged sword, and pierced her own heart. She died in silence, a victim of her own love and a monster's lie. Heracles, still alive but suffering a pain that made the labors seem like a distant dream, was carried by his son Hylas and his loyal friends back toward the mountains. He was a mountain of meat and agony, his legendary strength now a curse that kept him alive while the poison did its work. He looked up at the peaks of Mount Oeta, the place where he knew his journey must end. The cycle of his life was closing. The man who had cleaned the world of its monsters was now being consumed by the very monster he had slain at the beginning of his journey. The blood of the Hydra, the blood of the centaur, and the jealousy of a wife had combined to do what the lions, the giants, and the gods could not. He stood on the threshold of the final pyre, his eyes turned toward the sky, waiting for the fire to do what the water and the earth had failed to accomplish. The glory of Hera was almost complete. The mountain of Oeta stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the world, its peaks reaching toward the heavens as if trying to touch the very throne of Zeus. It was a place of jagged stone and ancient pines, where the wind whispered through the needles with a sound like the sighs of the fallen. To this place the hero was carried. Heracles, the son of the thunder and the earth, was now a broken colossus. The poisoned tunic of Nessus was no longer a garment. It was a part of his very biology, a network of toxic fire that had woven itself into his muscles and wrapped around his bones. Each breath was a labor more difficult than the capture of Cerberus, and each heartbeat was a drum of agony that vibrated through the silent mountain air. He was surrounded by those who loved him most, yet their presence was a hollow comfort against the relentless onslaught of the Hydra's venom. His son, Hylas, stood by his side, his face a mask of youthful grief and premature wisdom. The boy looked at his father, the man who had strangled lions and held the sky, and saw only a mountain of suffering. Heracles, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the roots of the mountain itself, gave his final commands. He asked his son to take Iole as his wife, to ensure that the lineage of the hero would continue, and to bring an end to the cycle of vengeance that had destroyed Oechalia. But his primary request was one of fire. He commanded his followers to build a massive pyre of oak and wild olive wood on the highest peak of Oeta. He sought the cleansing power of the flame to do what the water of the rivers and the air of the hills could not. He wanted the mortal part of him, the legacy of Alcmene, the flesh that could bleed and burn and feel the sting of jealousy, to be consumed, so that the divine spark granted by Zeus might finally be set free. The building of the pyre was a ritual of silence. The men gathered the wood, the resinous scent of the pine and the hard strength of the oak filling the air. They piled the logs high, creating a platform of cedar and ash that looked like an altar to the sun. Heracles climbed the pyre with a dignity that defied his condition. He lay down upon the wood, spreading his lion skin beneath him, and resting his head upon his club. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip below the edge of the sea, turning the sky the color of a bruise, violet, deep red, and the gray of cooling embers. A problem arose that tested the resolve of the mourners. No one among his friends or his family could bring themselves to set the torch to the wood. To light the fire was to kill the greatest man who had ever lived, and the hand of Hylas trembled at the thought. The sun sank lower, and the shadows of the pines grew long and thin, like the fingers of the dead. It seemed as if the hero might be trapped in his agony forever, a monument of pain on a mountain of wood. It was then that a traveler appeared on the mountain path. This was Poeas, a shepherd and a king of the Malians, or, in other versions of the myth, his son Philoctetes. He was a man who understood the nature of a bow and the necessity of a clean end. Seeing the hero's plight and the hesitation of the kin, Poeas stepped forward. Heracles looked at him, and in that silent exchange, a pact was formed. Poeas took the torch and touched it to the base of the pyre. In gratitude for this final service, Heracles gifted Poeas with his most legendary possession, his bow and the remaining poisoned arrows. This was a gift that would echo through the generations, for it was these very arrows that Philoctetes would eventually carry to the walls of Troy, fulfilling the prophecy that the city could not fall without the weapons of Heracles. The hero's influence was not ending with his life. It was branching out like the roots of a great oak, touching the destinies of kings yet unborn. As the flames took hold, the fire did not behave as a natural fire does. The resinous wood crackled and roared, the orange light reflecting in the eyes of the silent watchers. But as the heat intensified, a transformation began to occur. The ancient poets, from Sophocles to Ovid, describe this moment as the apotheosis, the deification of a mortal. The fire was not destroying Heracles. It was refining him. It was stripping away the layers of his human experience, the scars of his labors, the weight of his guilt, and the frailty of his mortality. Zeus, watching from the high seat of Olympus, looked down upon the mountain of Oeta. He saw his son, the champion he had sired to protect the world, finally reaching the end of his path. The king of the gods turned to the other immortals, including Hera, whose shadow had followed the hero since his first breath in the cradle. Zeus spoke of the justice of the hero's life and the depth of his suffering. He declared that the mortal part of Heracles had been paid for in blood and fire, and that the divine part, the part that belonged to the sky, could no longer be held by the earth. Hera, perhaps moved by the sheer persistence of the man she had tried to destroy, or perhaps recognizing that her own glory was inextricably linked to his, remained silent. Her silence was a form of consent. The celestial order was in agreement. Suddenly, the sky over Oeta was torn asunder. A thunderclap, louder than any the Greeks had ever heard, shook the very foundations of the Peloponnese. A massive, blindingly white cloud descended from the heavens, wrapping the peak of the mountain in a veil of mist and lightning. Within the heart of the storm, 4 magnificent horses, white as the foam of the sea, pulled a golden chariot driven by Athena herself. The goddess of wisdom, who had guided his hand against the Hydra and given him the rattles to flush the Stymphalian birds, reached out one last time. She lifted the spirit of Heracles from the ashes of the pyre. As the mortal body of the hero vanished into the flame, his divine essence ascended. He was no longer a man of muscle and bone. He was a being of pure light and celestial thunder. The chariot rose through the layers of the atmosphere, passing the stars and the moon, until the golden gates of Olympus swung open to receive him. Inside the halls of the gods, the reception was unlike any other. Heracles, the first mortal to earn his place among the 12 through virtue and labor alone, stood before his father. Zeus embraced him, and for the first time in his existence, the hero felt a peace that was not the absence of war, but the presence of eternity. The greatest of his enemies, Hera, stepped forward. In a gesture of supreme reconciliation, she adopted him as her own son in the divine family. She gave him her daughter, Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, in marriage. This union was the ultimate symbol of the hero's victory. He had mastered the age and the pain of the world, and now he was wedded to the very concept of youth and renewal. But while the hero found his rest in the high places of the gods, his presence on earth did not fade. He became a figure of unique worship, a being who occupied the space between a hero and a god. In the shrines of the ancient world, he was offered two types of sacrifice: a sacrifice for a hero at sunset, and a sacrifice for a god at sunrise. He was the Alexikakos, the averter of evil, the one whom the common people called upon when the shadows grew too long and the monsters of the world felt too close. His image was everywhere: in the gymnasiums where the youth trained their bodies, in the temples where the sick sought healing, and on the coins that traveled from the pillars of the west to the mountains of the east. He represented the idea that through ponos, toil and struggle, one could achieve arete, excellence and virtue. He was the proof that the human spirit, though burdened by the flaws of the heart and the whims of the gods, could endure anything and emerge transformed. As the centuries passed and the marble temples of Thebes and Tiryns fell into ruin, the story of Heracles did not die. It evolved. The Romans took him as their Hercules, emphasizing his role as a traveler and a bringer of civilization. The philosophers saw in his 12 labors an allegory for the struggles of the human soul against its own internal monsters: the lion of pride, the hydra of desire, the stables of accumulated neglect. He became the universal champion, a figure who looks the serpent of chaos in the eye and does not blink. He is the comfort of the endurance. He is the spirit that tells us that no matter how heavy the sky, we have the strength to hold it. No matter how deep the filth, we have the wisdom to clean it. No matter how dark the underworld, we have the courage to return from it. Listen to the world around you. In the modern world, we understand the rumble of the earth as tectonic plates and the light in the sky as electrical discharge. But close your eyes. Forget the science for a moment. Feel the vibration in your chest. That is the echo of the Heroes Club. That is the sound of the son of Zeus making his rounds, ensuring that the walls of the world hold, that the harvest is safe, and that the shadows stay where they belong. The myths may be stories, the altars may be dust, the oak trees of Oeta may have rotted away, but the strength of Heracles remains. It lives in every act of quiet persistence, in every moment of defiance against despair, and in every hand that reaches out to lift a burden for another. As long as the sun rises over the Aegean and the stars wheel through the velvet dark of the night, the greatest of all heroes lives. He is the light in the darkness, the shield against the storm, and the memory that belongs to all of us. Thank you for journeying with me through the long and arduous life of the son of Zeus, from the cradle in Thebes to the golden halls of Olympus, from the depths of the marsh to the heights of the pyre. If you found peace in the story of the hero, and if his journey helped you find your own strength today, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. May your walls be strong, may your hearth be warm, and may you always find the power to overcome the monsters in your path. Sleep well.